It was a cold winter morning, December 1944, over the skies of Nazi-occupied Europe. Below, the strategic stronghold of the German forces lay nestled within the dense, snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. The air, thick with tension, hummed with the sound of roaring engines as a fleet of Allied bombers flew overhead, their mission clear: to cripple the heart of the German defense. The soldiers below, entrenched and weary from the continuous bombardment, had long believed their stronghold impenetrable. But today, they would learn the brutal reality of war. Nothing was safe. As the first wave of bombs rained down, the ground shook violently, sending plumes of smoke and fire into the frigid air. The once impregnable fortress now lay in ruins, the faces of the German soldiers frozen in disbelief. For the first time, they understood what true terror felt like. In that moment, the tide of war seemed to shift, and the Allied forces would soon see the results of their relentless air campaign. The stronghold was broken, but at what cost? The consequences of this attack would echo through the battlefields, marking a pivotal turning point in the struggle for control over Europe. The year was 1944, and the war in Europe had entered a critical phase. The Allies, having secured vital victories across the continent, were now pressing deeper into the heart of Nazi-occupied territory. The D-Day landings in June had marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, but the Germans were far from defeated. Their defenses were formidable, their command structure tightly controlled, and their resolve unbroken. The battlefronts were spread thin, but there was still one area where the Nazis held a key advantage: the Ardennes region. Nestled between Belgium and Luxembourg, the dense forests of the Ardennes were known for their natural terrain that made it an ideal location for fortified positions. German forces had transformed the region into a heavily fortified stronghold, complete with bunkers, anti-aircraft defenses, and entrenched positions that allowed them to maintain a tight grip on the Western Front. But it wasn't just the geography that made the Ardennes formidable. This was a region teeming with historical significance, a place where the Germans had carved out a significant line of defense, called the West Wall, or Siegfried Line. However, despite the relentless pressure the Allies had put on the Germans throughout the year, the Nazis had managed to hold their ground in key locations, including the Ardennes. The area became the focal point for one of the most intense air campaigns the Allies would ever launch. On the other side, the Allies were desperately trying to cripple the German war machine. Despite suffering heavy losses, they had made substantial progress through France and Belgium. The relentless bombings of German factories, supply lines, and military infrastructure had crippled their ability to resupply and maintain their forces. The Luftwaffe was struggling to keep up with the growing power of the Allied air forces. Every major stronghold in the region was a prime target for destruction. By December 1944, the Allies had launched a series of strategic bombing campaigns aimed at weakening the Germans. The skies were filled with the buzz of B-17 flying fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and other heavy bombers making their way across the European theater. The Allies' air superiority had become one of the most potent weapons in their arsenal, and it would soon be tested against the German bastion in the Ardennes. In the days leading up to the bombing raids, intelligence reports had confirmed that the Ardennes stronghold was a linchpin for the German defense strategy in the West. It housed vital infrastructure, command centers, and communication hubs necessary for coordinating their defense efforts. The attack was more than just a tactical strike. It was a strategic attempt to knock the Germans off balance and destabilize their entire defensive posture. The first wave of bombers would arrive on December 16th, and what they encountered would forever change the course of the war. The scale of the Allied air assault was unprecedented. December 1944 marked a time of intensified cooperation between the American and British forces, their bombers and fighters working in tight coordination to strike at the heart of the German war effort. The weather, however, would not make it easy. The winter months had brought heavy cloud cover and fog, making it difficult for the Allied air forces to carry out precision strikes. Yet, despite these challenges, the Allies knew the urgency of the task at hand. The Ardennes was a critical junction for the Germans. Any significant disruption in their ability to communicate or supply their forces could cause a breakdown in their entire defense system. The German High Command, led by General Oberst Hans von Seeckt, had predicted that the Allies would soon push for an attack on their Western Front. They had prepared for a prolonged siege and believed the rugged, forested region would act as a natural barrier against any major offensive. But they were wrong. In the early morning hours of December 16th, hundreds of Allied bombers, escorted by squadrons of fighter planes, began their journey across the Channel. With precision honed over years of bitter conflict, they unleashed their payloads on the German stronghold. The first bombers released their deadly cargo, and within minutes, the silence of the winter landscape was shattered. Explosions ripped through the cold morning air, sending shock waves that could be felt miles away. The bombing targets were carefully chosen. They struck vital communications hubs, supply depots, fuel storage facilities, and airfields, rendering the Germans unable to coordinate or reinforce their defensive positions. Entire regiments of soldiers found themselves stranded in the Ardennes, cut off from reinforcements. The sudden devastation, coupled with the chaos on the ground, left the German forces in a state of disbelief. From the German perspective, this was an unexpected blow. They had not anticipated such a thorough assault, especially given the difficult winter conditions that made movement on the ground near impossible. The forces stationed in the Ardennes, already stretched thin from months of heavy fighting, had no means of fending off the aerial bombardment. Bunkers, once thought to be impervious to attack, crumbled under the weight of the bombs. In the moments after the bombing, German soldiers were stunned, their spirits broken. The soldiers who had once believed their fortress to be invulnerable now realized how vulnerable they were. They had no answers for the scale of the destruction. For many, this was a pivotal moment, a cruel reminder of how quickly the tide of war could turn. The once feared German stronghold was now a smoldering ruin, leaving the Allies with a glimmer of hope that victory was within reach. One human angle, the soldiers' fear. In the quiet before the storm, the German soldiers entrenched within the Ardennes stronghold had lived a life of tension, always awaiting the next Allied advance. The harsh winter had already made their existence unbearable, with the cold seeping into their bones, food rations running low, and morale at an all-time low. Their commanders had assured them that their defenses were impenetrable, that the forest would keep the Allies at bay, and that their stronghold would hold steady. But the bombers that appeared in the sky shattered that belief. For the soldiers on the ground, the initial roar of the bombers was almost a death knell. As the first wave of bombs rained down, panic gripped the defenders. They rushed for cover, seeking shelter in whatever was available. The cold, jagged trenches, bunkers, or even beneath the thick canopy of trees that had long protected them. But it was futile. No place could offer protection from the sheer magnitude of the Allied assault. When the bombing stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. The air was thick with smoke, the sky shrouded in a layer of dark clouds. The ground was torn apart, and the once pristine forest was now a patchwork of destruction. What remained of their fortifications was reduced to rubble, and the German soldiers, once sure of their position, now faced an impossible reality. Their stronghold was gone, and their ability to fight back was severely compromised. As some soldiers tried to regroup and assess the damage, they found themselves faced with something they had not anticipated: fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of an enemy that had broken through their defenses in a way they could not fathom. For the first time, the once confident German forces felt vulnerable. 2. Tactical angle. The precision of the bombing campaign. From a military perspective, the Allied bombing campaign against the German stronghold in the Ardennes was an example of precise, calculated strategy. The Allied High Command understood the significance of the region to the German forces, and every effort was made to ensure that the bombing targets were chosen for maximum disruption. The bombers struck with surgical precision, targeting vital infrastructure that would cripple the Germans' ability to respond. The bombings were not simply random acts of destruction. They were well-planned strikes on key supply depots, communication hubs, and airfields that supported the German war effort in the West. The destruction of these facilities would have long-lasting effects on the Germans' ability to maintain their defensive positions, ensuring that the Allies could continue their advance. The effectiveness of the bombing was clear. The Germans were left without adequate supplies, communication, or the means to reinforce their position. In the absence of these critical components, their defense began to crumble. The German forces, once able to fight in a coordinated manner, now found themselves fractured and disorganized, vulnerable to Allied advances from both the air and the ground. 3. Technological angle, the power of Allied air superiority. The role of technology in this battle cannot be understated. The Allied forces had achieved near-total air superiority by late 1944, a critical factor in their success. The heavy bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, were the backbone of this campaign. These machines, capable of carrying vast payloads of bombs, could deliver devastating attacks from altitudes that kept them safe from the reach of German anti-aircraft fire. Allied air forces had refined their bombing techniques over years of brutal conflict, and this was evident in the precision of their strikes. They had perfected the use of radar and targeting technology to ensure that their bombs hit their marks with deadly accuracy. In the Ardennes, this technological edge gave them the upper hand. The German defenses were simply no match for the overwhelming firepower of the Allied bombers. As the bombers soared through the skies, escorted by squadrons of fighters to protect them from the Luftwaffe, the Allies knew their technological advantage would tip the scales. The Germans had been caught in a position where their defenses were no longer sufficient to protect their stronghold. The war in the air was just as significant as the war on the ground, and the Allies were using their technological superiority to devastating effect. For leadership angle, the collapse of German command. For the German leadership, the attack on their Ardennes stronghold was not just a tactical failure. It was a devastating blow to their strategic vision for the Western Front. General Oberst Hans von Seeckt, the German commander responsible for the Ardennes defense, had placed his faith in the fortifications and the rugged terrain to withstand the onslaught of Allied forces. His strategy was one of delay and attrition, to hold the line for as long as possible and prevent a rapid Allied advance into Germany. However, the sheer scale of the bombing raids left little room for tactical adjustments. As the bombing destroyed critical infrastructure, communication broke down between the various German units. The stronghold, once a symbol of German resilience, now became a liability, and the Germans were left with little coordination or leadership to mount an effective counteroffensive. The command structure faltered in the face of such chaos, and confusion spread among the ranks. The generals and field officers, who had believed they were securing the Western Front, now found themselves caught off guard by the Allied air supremacy and its immediate effects on the battlefield. In this context, the lack of a unified response from the German leadership was glaring. While the Allies had a clear strategy, with a focus on coordinated airstrikes and ground support, the German High Command had underestimated the full scope of the Allied air threat. The collapse of their leadership at this critical juncture would mark a turning point in the war, as the Germans scrambled to recover from the loss of their most crucial stronghold in the Ardennes. 5. Enemy angle, the German soldiers' resolve versus the reality of war. While the German commanders were preoccupied with strategic responses, the soldiers in the field were grappling with a much more immediate and personal reality. Many soldiers stationed in the Ardennes had been through multiple campaigns, and their resolve was both hardened and weary. The concept of honor, duty, and loyalty to the Reich were deeply ingrained, and their training had prepared them for prolonged conflict. However, nothing could have prepared them for the overwhelming scale of the Allied air assault. After the bombing, those who survived the initial onslaught had to face the daunting task of picking up the pieces of their shattered defense. The soldiers, who had once believed their fortifications were impregnable, now found themselves in a desperate struggle for survival. The Allied bombs had not only destroyed their infrastructure, but had also severely damaged their sense of invulnerability. The personal toll on the German soldiers was immense, as many were left to face the psychological aftermath of the attack, fear, confusion, and the dawning realization that the war was no longer in their favor. As the soldiers tried to regroup and reinforce their positions, they found it difficult to reconcile their training with the brutal reality of the situation. The shock and fear of being bombed by an unseen enemy from the skies left many soldiers questioning their leadership and their survival. The human cost of the bombing was not just in the physical destruction, but also in the collapse of the psychological defenses that had kept the German forces fighting for so long. 6. Moral angle, the ethics of aerial bombardment. The Allied air assault on the Ardennes raises an important moral question, To what extent can the use of overwhelming air power be justified in warfare? The destruction of the German stronghold in the Ardennes, while militarily effective, resulted in significant collateral damage. Entire communities were caught in the blast radius of the bombings, and civilians who lived in the surrounding areas suffered from the widespread destruction. The moral calculus of warfare often places the lives of soldiers and civilians in direct opposition, and the sheer scale of the bombing campaign left many to question the ethics of such tactics. The Allies justified the attack by highlighting the importance of crippling the German war effort and the need to gain air superiority. However, this did not mitigate the devastation faced by the German civilians who lived in the region. Many of the inhabitants were forced to flee their homes or suffered from the psychological trauma of the bombings. The line between military necessity and civilian suffering often blurred in such campaigns, leaving the moral questions lingering long after the dust settled. In the grand narrative of the war, such questions are not easily answered. The war against the Axis powers required tough decisions and difficult trade-offs. Yet, the bombing of the Ardennes stronghold serves as a reminder of the human cost of such victories. While the strategic gains were undeniable, the ethical implications of the attack would continue to be debated long after the war had ended. The hour of reckoning had arrived. The Allied bombers had done their work, and the Ardennes stronghold was in ruins. But the German forces, still reeling from the unexpected devastation, found themselves with little time to recover. The Allies knew this was their moment. If they could capitalize on the chaos created by the air strikes, they could shatter the Germans' hold on the region once and for all. The aftermath of the bombing campaign sent shockwaves through the German military. Reports flooded in from the field, each one confirming the scale of the destruction. The once formidable defenses, the bunkers and fortifications that had been so meticulously constructed, were now reduced to rubble. The logistical and communication hubs that the German high command had so heavily relied upon were incapacitated, leaving them unable to mount an effective counteroffensive. The battlefield, once dominated by the Germans, now lay open for the taking. But the turning point would not come from a single heroic act or tactical maneuver. It would come from the relentless pressure the Allies applied in the weeks following the bombing. The sheer scale of the Allied coordination, the bombing raids, the ground offensives, and the strategic cutoffs left the Germans scrambling to regroup and reorganize. Their lines were broken, and their ability to conduct military operations was severely compromised. On the ground, the German soldiers, already fatigued from months of fighting, were faced with an almost insurmountable task: defend against a foe that had already torn through their strongest defenses. The bombing had shattered their morale, and the soldiers' resolve, once unwavering, began to crumble. The shock of seeing their stronghold, their last line of defense, obliterated, left them questioning the very fabric of their strategy. For the Allies, the bombing had delivered the first major blow. But they knew the war was far from over. The true turning point would come in the weeks ahead, as they moved to exploit the devastation wrought by the bombing. In the wake of the destruction, the Germans would attempt to stabilize their positions, but the damage was done. The Germans no longer controlled the narrative. The Allies had gained the upper hand. This shift, this sudden change in the tide, would have long-lasting consequences. The Ardennes had been a pivotal stronghold, and its loss marked the beginning of the end for German supremacy in the region. But the full consequences of the bombing, the shifting power dynamics, and the mounting pressure on the Germans would not become fully apparent until the weeks that followed. As the bombers returned to their bases, the reverberations of their strikes continued to echo across the Ardennes. The Allies knew that a key piece of the German defensive line had been shattered, but the battle was far from over. The Germans, despite the initial shock and confusion, began to regroup. The devastation of the stronghold was significant, but the war machine was not so easily defeated. The strategic advantage, however, was now firmly in the hands of the Allies. In the following days, the Allies launched a series of ground offensives aimed at exploiting the gap in the German defenses. With their supply lines cut and their communications in disarray, the Germans struggled to maintain their positions. The Allies, particularly the American forces, advanced rapidly through the now vulnerable Ardennes, seizing key towns and villages that had once been heavily guarded by the Germans. The bombing had softened the German defenses, and now it was time to press the advantage. On the ground, the clash between the two forces was brutal. The Germans, battered and demoralized, fought valiantly to hold their positions. But they were no match for the overwhelming force of the Allied advance. The bombers had torn apart their infrastructure, and now the Allies were dismantling their front lines with precision and determination. In many cases, German troops found themselves isolated, unable to receive reinforcements or supplies. This isolation further strained their ability to defend the region. The Allied forces, with their superior air support and logistical coordination, pushed forward with relentless determination. By the end of the month, the Germans were forced to retreat from the Ardennes, leaving behind a landscape of destruction and chaos. What had once been their most fortified position was now a battlefield littered with the wreckage of their failed defense. For the Allies, this marked the beginning of a series of victories that would eventually lead them to the heart of Nazi Germany. The bombing of the Ardennes stronghold, combined with the subsequent ground offensives, shifted the momentum of the war. The German military, once a dominant force in Europe, was now on the defensive, scrambling to regroup in the face of an unstoppable enemy. The strategic importance of the Ardennes had been clear to both sides. For the Germans, it represented a crucial linchpin in their defense of the Western Front. For the Allies, it was a target that, once destroyed, would pave the way for further advances into German-held territory. The bombing had achieved its purpose. It disrupted the German war effort, weakened their resolve, and left their forces exposed. But the true turning point came when the Allies, capitalizing on this newfound vulnerability, pressed forward with an aggressive campaign that left the Germans with little room to maneuver. As the dust settled and the Allies took control of the region, the German military found itself in a precarious position. The loss of the Ardennes stronghold was not just a military setback. It was a psychological blow that sent shockwaves through the Nazi command. The once imposing fortress had fallen, and the consequences of that defeat would resonate throughout the remainder of the war. The immediate aftermath of the bombing and subsequent Allied advances left the German forces in disarray. The destruction of their Ardennes stronghold was not just a tactical defeat. It was a psychological and logistical disaster. For the Germans, the fall of such a critical position signified more than the loss of territory. It was a sign that the war was turning decisively against them. As the Allies pressed forward, they began to capitalize on the gaps in the German defenses. The bombing raids had done their work, cutting off supplies, damaging infrastructure, and demoralizing the German soldiers. But what followed was the systematic dismantling of the German defense network. The Allies seized control of key towns and villages, most notably in the Ardennes, and pushed deeper into the heart of German-occupied territory. German resistance was fierce, but the strategic momentum had shifted. The retreat of German forces from the Ardennes left behind a trail of destruction, not just in the form of shattered fortifications, but also in the collapse of their command and communication structures. As the Allies advanced, the Germans were unable to properly coordinate their movements. Units found themselves stranded, unable to communicate effectively with their superiors or supply lines, which had been severed by the relentless bombing raids. This created confusion and disorder within the German ranks. In the days following the battle, German commanders attempted to regroup, but it was clear that the damage had been done. Their once formidable defensive line had been broken, and the Allies, now with the initiative, exploited every weakness in the German position. The defeat in the Ardennes was a critical blow to the Wehrmacht, both on the ground and in the minds of the soldiers fighting for the Nazi regime. Meanwhile, the Allies continued their advance. The destruction of the Ardennes stronghold was followed by the liberation of numerous towns and cities in Belgium and Luxembourg. The German retreat was not without its own losses. Retreating soldiers faced the Allied air superiority, constant bombardment, and the pressure of the advancing forces. The Germans had been forced to abandon vital defensive positions, leaving them exposed to further attacks. The Allied victory in the Ardennes had profound implications for the German war effort. The loss of such a crucial defensive stronghold sent shockwaves through the German command structure, weakening morale and leaving them vulnerable to the inevitable Allied push deeper into Germany. The stage was set for the final stages of the war in Europe, as the Germans scrambled to re-establish their defenses. In the weeks that followed the destruction of the Ardennes stronghold, the Germans were forced to shift their strategy in an attempt to stabilize their crumbling front lines. The blow dealt by the Allies' bombing raids, combined with the rapid ground offensives that followed, left them with little room to maneuver. The loss of their defensive position in the Ardennes was not merely a military setback, it was a profound moment of reckoning for Nazi Germany. By January 1945, the Allies had successfully driven the Germans back from the Ardennes, forcing them to abandon one of their most fortified positions. The bombing raids had done the job of destabilizing German control, but the subsequent Allied push turned the tide of the war. The loss of the region severely weakened Germany's ability to defend the Western Front, and their withdrawal from the Ardennes left them with fewer resources to resist the advancing Allied forces. On the strategic level, the German High Command now found itself unable to counter the pressure from both the Western Allies and the Soviet forces advancing from the east. With the Ardennes lost, the Germans were forced to prioritize defensive positions along the Rhine River, where they would make their final stand. This withdrawal further drained Germany's resources, as troops and supplies were redirected from one beleaguered front to another, leaving them vulnerable to a series of crippling defeats in the coming months. The psychological toll on the German troops was immense. Many had fought for years, enduring constant hardship, and the fall of the Ardennes represented the final collapse of the once mighty Wehrmacht. Soldiers who had once believed in the invincibility of their strongholds and their ability to repel the Allies were now left to confront the harsh reality. The war was slipping out of their control. The loss of such a crucial defensive position shattered the myth of German superiority and forced many to question the viability of continued resistance. For the Allies, the victory in the Ardennes was a clear sign that their strategy was working. The bombing raids, combined with their relentless ground assaults, had severely disrupted the German war effort. The Allies' air superiority had been a decisive factor in the success of the campaign, and they continued to press their advantage. The destruction of the Ardennes stronghold was a victory in more ways than one. It not only broke the German defenses, but also sent a clear message. The Allies had the upper hand, and the end of the war was within sight. In the larger context of the war, the fall of the Ardennes marked the beginning of the final phase of the European conflict. The Allies' success in this region paved the way for the liberation of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and set the stage for the final assault on Germany. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, the German military was forced into a defensive posture that they would never recover from. The loss of the Ardennes stronghold, combined with the strategic pressure from all sides, left Germany with little more than a shattered remnant of its former fighting force. It was only a matter of time before the final collapse would occur. The bombing of the Ardennes stronghold in December 1944 serves as a stark reminder of the sheer devastation and power that warfare can unleash. In a single moment, a fortified position that had been a symbol of German resilience crumbled under the weight of Allied air superiority. What followed was a cascade of consequences. The disintegration of German defenses, the loss of critical supply lines, and the unraveling of their once formidable military command. This event did not just mark a shift in the battlefield, it marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. For the Allies, the victory in the Ardennes was a testament to the effectiveness of strategic bombing, the coordinated use of air power, and the relentless pursuit of victory. It was a triumph of planning and execution, as well as an example of how the psychological and logistical aspects of war are just as critical as the battlefield tactics themselves. The psychological blow to the German forces was profound. Once confident in their stronghold, they were now forced to confront the fragility of their defenses and their position in the war. The destruction of the Ardennes stronghold also offers a poignant reflection on the nature of war. While the Allies celebrated their success, the human cost of this victory was immeasurable. The destruction of cities, the loss of life, and the suffering endured by soldiers and civilians alike all stand as a grim reminder that war, even when fought for noble causes, leaves scars that are not easily healed. As we look back on this pivotal moment in history, it becomes clear that the events of December 1944 were not just about military strategy. They were about the breaking of an empire. The fall of the Ardennes stronghold symbolized the collapse of the Nazi war machine, the shattering of an ideology that had terrorized much of the world. And in the aftermath, the world was left to rebuild, to reflect on the cost of war, and to seek a future where such destruction would never again be allowed to unfold. The destruction of this key German position in the Ardennes is not just a story of military tactics. It is a story of the resilience of those who fought for a free Europe. And it is a reminder that, in the end, even the most seemingly impenetrable strongholds can fall when faced with the determination, strength, and unity of those committed to a cause greater than themselves.